Welcome to the module on creating an effective classroom plan. My name is Selina Merrell and I am the project director for Reach Mississippi. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the components of an effective classroom PBIS plan. What are the basic principles of behavior? And we're going to describe and talk a little bit about behavioral management techniques. So when we think about classroom management, it's really all these different skills and techniques that teachers use to help students become organized, orderly, focused, attentive, on task, and of course, academically productive during their class. So it's really about putting those systems and structures in place so that students are more likely to be successful. So when we're thinking about an effective classroom plan, these are the different components. So we want to look at classroom rules and how we're going to teach them. What is your attention getting signal? Is your daily schedule posted? What are student routines, teacher routines? How are we reinforcing appropriate behavior? And then talk a little bit about a consequence ladder. When we think about classroom rules, two of the most important things is that we want to make sure that they are both measurable and observable. So we can count, we can time whether or not the student's doing it, and we can see whether or not the student's doing it. We also want to make sure that they're positively stated because we're going from a mindset of telling kids what not to do, stop doing that, don't do that, quit doing that. And my all-time favorite, I've told you 1,000 times not to do that, right? What's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So we want to make sure that we're switching our mindset and we're going to positively state it. Raise your hand before speaking, ask permission before getting out of your seat. So we're telling the student what it is, the behavior that we want to see, what it is that we want them to do. And if your school is implementing school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports, then we want to make sure that your classroom rules are aligning with your school-wide expectations. So for example, if your school's expectations are be respectful, be responsible, and be safe. So what does it look like in your classroom to be responsible, respectful, and safe? So making sure that we are supporting those school-wide expectations when we're thinking about creating our classroom rules. So the other big part, it's not just about having your rules posted on your wall. It really is about how are you going to go about teaching them. So how are you initially going to teach them? How are you going to reteach them? How are you going to use them for pre-correction, telling the kid what it is you want them to do before they do it, right? So all of those things need to be worked out. How are you going to actively involve the kids in that process and then give them the opportunity to practice the rules? We found that it's always good to provide non-examples and then examples, and the students really enjoy being involved and acting these out for the rest of their classmates. And then the other big part about rules is that how are you going to use that pre-correction that I talked about or reminders throughout the day, or we always know there's certain times during the day when behaviors seem to bubble up a little bit more than others. So how are we using that pre-correction or those reminders prior to when we know that problem behaviors have a tendency to arise? So when you're thinking, once you've created your classroom rules, observable, measurable, positively stated, supportive of your school-wide expectations, then how are we going to initially teach, reteach, and use pre-correction while all along having the students involved in that process? So the video is going to pause right now for a question. All right, so once we've created our classroom rules, then we want to think about our attention-getting signal. It can be auditory, it can be visual. It would be great if it was something that could be used across the school, like school-wide, wherever you might be with your students. Some examples, you could use a timer, you could stand in the middle of the room, you could use that awkward silence, that awkward teacher silence. I know in some elementary and middle schools, they use the call and response, hootie, hoo, right? So that's the signal for the students to come back. You might be able to use some helpful students. You could have a countdown. Oftentimes, when I'm doing face-to-face training with adults, I'll say you have 30 seconds, 30 seconds, and then you have 15, 15, right? So giving them time to transition or letting them know that they're getting a little bit too loud. You could make a special noise. It could be a bell. It could be once at a conference, they used a xylophone. And so when we heard the xylophone, we knew that that was our signal to get to where we needed to be. So some kind of special noise. Or you could do something as simple as raising your hand, right, with the high five, and waiting for everybody to give you eye contact. So when you're using when you're selecting your attention getting signal, think about if it would be something that you could use school-wide. Once you get it into place, then make sure that you are at least verbally praising those students that are following the signal. All right, so we have our rules, we have our signal, and now we're going to talk a little bit about routines. First, we need to think about student routines. How are you going to teach to the students how you want them to enter class, leave class? Do they leave when the bell rings, or do they wait for you to dismiss them? If they need to, and I know that nowadays this doesn't happen very often, but if they need to sharpen their pencil or throw something away, go to the restroom, what is the process for that? What do transitions look like? What is it that you want them to do when you're transitioning from one activity to another? So we need to make sure that we are being really clear, giving, again, time to practice and understand what it is that you want them to do. The other side of that is making sure that your physical environment is set up to support your routines, enhance the effectiveness of your procedures and your instruction. So we want to make sure that we prevent congestion and that you can pretty easily get to any seat that you need to get to within the classroom. We need to think about if they're going to go and get their Chromebooks. Are you going to have all 30 of them go get their Chromebooks at one time? What's that process going to look like? We want to make sure that we minimize distraction. And so sometimes when you go into classrooms, it kind of looks like Oriental trading threw up in the classroom, right? There's just so much decorations and stuff everywhere. And that says that the teacher really cares, but it could also really be a distraction for certain students in your classroom. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that it's not bare, right? And that the only thing is, the in God we trust over above the light switch. So you want to make sure that there's a nice balance in the classroom. Of course, it's always recommended that things on the wall are teaching tools or reminder tools and that kind of stuff. Student work is always great to have up, but just take a look at your classroom and think about that. It says a lot when you walk into a classroom, just the visual of the classroom. And then thinking about teacher routines. And again, always need to go back to how is it that we're going to teach these to the students. So what if a kid finishes their work early? What are they supposed to do? What is your greeting going to be? I would always stand in the doorway with my back against one side of the door so I could see down the hallway, but I could also see in the classroom. I'd kind of, greet the kids as they were coming in. Twofold: one, it helps with that relationship, but it also gives you a quick opportunity to kind of take a look at the kid to see where they are mentally, emotionally when they're coming into the classroom. We had a kid named B-Coat, and if he came to my door with half of his hair out and out of his braids and the other half still braided, and he'd have his hoodie on backwards, that was a telltale sign that he needed to go and speak with a counselor or therapist before he came into the classroom. So the greeting is really important. Are you going to escort students? Again, once you've created that signal for attention, we want to make sure that we're teaching that to the students. I see so many teachers kind of lose kids when they're given directions. Um, they'll give 3 to 5 step directions to a kid, and to the students, and one of the students or a couple of the students will miss the first one or second one, so they're leaning over, asking another student, what did she say, and then that student misses one. So a great tip or strategy to use when you're giving directions: give a direction, kind of do an eye scan to make sure everybody's on board, give your next direction, do that eye scan to make sure everybody's on board, and that's going to cut down on a lot. Providing feedback or correction, and I'm not sure if I say this later, but we want to make sure that we praise in public and correct in private. And then grading. What's your grading system? So all of these different teacher routines need to be taught to the students, of course, at the beginning of the school year, but also if you see more than 1 or 2 kids in your class having difficulty knowing what it is that they're supposed to do, then we may want to go back and do a reteach of these to the whole class. If it's just a couple of kids, then doing that individual kind of reteaching with them around your routines and what you expect. So you could create a classroom routine matrix and post it on the wall. You'll see the first column is the routine, so it might be, finishing work early. What is it that you expect? What is the signal for them to do that? So if we take a look at Coach Bagley's classroom routines, you'll see in the first column on the left, the expectations: ready, respectful. So their school apparently is implementing PBIS. And then you'll see the Coach Bagley's classroom routines in the first row, and then group work, desk work, quizzes and tests, arrival, dismissal. And then he lays out under each of those the behavior he expects students to demonstrate. So it's real clear, and again, it would be great if you could post this up on the wall. A visual for some kids, and even for some teachers, is a helpful tool. So we're going to pause here for a question. All right, so we have our rules, we have our attention getting signal, we've taught our student routines, we've taught our teacher routines, and now we need to talk a little bit about how are we going to reinforce those desired behaviors, and what is it going to be our consistent and structured response to inappropriate behaviors. And here is what I was saying earlier about praising in public and correct in private, always whenever possible. So when we think about reinforcement, it should always be contingent on the desired behavior, meaning the kid needs to make the connection between why they're being reinforced and the behavior that is being reinforced, right? We want them to make the connection because reinforcement strengthens behavior, and we need to make sure that the kid has a real clear understanding of what behavior we're trying to strengthen, right? So always contingent on the desired behavior. So when we think about some examples of positive reinforcement or positive consequences around the classroom, it could be something as simple as verbal or teacher praise. Make sure it's really specific. I really like the way that you stuck, instead of just saying, oh, great job, we want to say something like, I really like the way that you stuck with that. I know it was difficult for you, but you finished it, right? So again, making sure that the kid really understands the behavior that we're reinforcing. Just demonstration of teacher approval, that could be a smile or a little head nod, some nonverbal. It could be points that students earn, then that they can cash in for privileges or rewards. You could have a list of menus, a menu that the student can choose from. You can do a combination. A lot of our schools that we have been working with do what they call positive office referral. So it's kind of like a not so good office referral, but it's about something positive that the student did. They write it up, they send it to the principal. The principal makes an announcement over the loudspeaker. They actually post the positive office referral in the office for that week, so the student gets that recognition as well. Others, contingent use of breaks or privileges, access to special activities, of course. We talked a little bit about the token economy. There could be mystery awards, excuse me, public recognition, like student of the month or class of the month, and then always, that parent contact or family member contact. Typically when they see the school's number, for some parents it's not always such a good phone call. So it would be great if we could call parents when students are doing good things and making positive contributions to the classroom. It's a little bit about that behavior-specific praise that I was talking about at the beginning of the last slide. It really helps the student learn what positive behaviors look like and feel like. It increases the likelihood that the student is going to engage in those behaviors again in the future. So, like I said, we want to make sure that we're being really precise about the description of the behavior that we're reinforcing. So if we have, I love that you are following directions, right? Awesome job holding the door. Nice work cleaning up after your self and accepting no. So again, being really precise and specific about what behavior that we're trying to reinforce. The whole reason we use reinforcement is because we want students to do that behavior again. So when we think about a hierarchy of consequences for problem behaviors, we've kind of gone away from like the clip charts or putting kids' names on the boards or the colors, because we don't, one is that it still is focusing on negative behaviors, right? And two, we don't want the first question a parent to ask when they get in the car, particularly like elementary school, is, what color were you? Instead of saying, did you make a friend today? Did you do something nice today? What did you learn today? And so we're kind of going away from those public kind of displays of negative behavior. So we don't want to ignore the problem behavior unless we think that the function of that behavior, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides, is about adult attention. If we think that the kid is doing the behavior to gain adult attention, then perhaps we might want to use that, ignoring the problem behavior kind of strategy. The next thing is that consequences should be predictable. They should be established, predictable consequences, meaning if I'm a student in your classroom and I choose to do A, B, or C, I should know what the consequence is going to be before I choose to do that behavior. The other thing is that it needs to be consistent across the students. If student A gets this consequence for this behavior, student B should get the same consequence for that behavior. Unless there's some kind of, tier 2 or tier 3 kind of individual plan for those kids. But across the board, we need to make sure that we're being consistent in our administration of the consequences, no matter who the kid is, if we like the kid, don't like the kid, who's the kid's mama, and that kind of stuff. And we also want to think about establishing those individual consequences, perhaps in group consequences. So individual consequences might be something like verbal warning, reteach or redirect, parent contact, and then it becomes an office discipline referral. Group consequences might be something like we'll listen to music while you all are working independently, but if anybody starts talking while we're supposed to be working independently, the music is going to go off. So again, thinking about that, thinking about the structure, and again, you want to build from the least intrusive to the most intrusive consequence. We want to be fair and consistent across the classroom on how we're administering those consequences to students across the board. So we're going to pause here for a question. All right. So we talked a little bit about creating your structure, right? Creating your systems, your rules, your attention-getting signals, student and teacher routines, about making sure that we have some type of reinforcement for individual and group, making sure that we have a system of consequences that is hierarchy from the least to the most intrusive, and that we're administering those consequences fair and equally across the classroom. So now I want to talk a little bit about prevention. So how can we discourage or prevent problem behaviors from occurring? So a couple of things about discouraging inappropriate behaviors. One is that you need to be up moving about the classroom. You can't be sitting behind your desk or on your computer and then have all of the students out there, right? You need to be up moving around. We want to scan with both our ears and our eyes, because you've been doing this for a little bit, you can typically see when something might start getting to escalate a little bit. You can hear about when things might begin escalating a little bit. So we need to be up moving around, scanning with our eyes and our ears. We want to use those positive frequent contacts with kids. That's part of developing that rapport or that positive relationship with the kid. And I'm sure that you all have seen where a kid is having a hard time. There might be one or two staff members standing around asking the kid to do giving the kid a directive. The kid's being non-compliant with those two teachers or staff members. And then another teacher will come in and say, hey, well, come on, let's get up and come with me. And the kid gets up and comes with them. Part of that is around that frequent positive contact, right? Because you've developed that rapport and that relationship with that kid prior to asking them to do something. We want to make sure that we're that we're acknowledging individuals and group for positive behavior, desired behavior. We want to make sure that we're maximizing opportunities for student responses. If students feel like they're going to have to frequently respond, they're going to be more engaged and more on task, because they never know when they're going to have to respond to another student's question or a teacher's question. Also, when we are, giving students an opportunity to respond, we want to make sure that we're not calling on the same kids all of the time. Because we want to get all kids engaged and involved in what's going on in the classroom. And when I was a student in high school, even probably in junior high, high school, I would never raise my hand to answer a question because I knew the teacher was never going to call on me. Even though I might have known the answer, I still didn't raise my hands. Kids know I'm not going to bother raise my hand because she never calls on me anyways, right? And so we want to make sure that we're giving all kids across the classroom equal opportunities, but also maximizing those opportunities for student responses to get engaged. And nowadays with, technology, it's so much easier than back in the day when you had to create something. I had little individual chalkboards. I had little popsicle sticks that had T and F on, one side and then A or B on the other side. I had kids using shaving cream, writing the answer on their desk. But nowadays, with technology, that's really great to be able to get all of those kids involved with responding to questions. Correct behavior calmly and firmly. And again, we don't want to try to embarrass anybody. We don't want to lose our cool if we're asking kids to demonstrate self-management and regulate their emotions, and we're screaming and yelling and all of that kind of stuff in the classroom, then we are not modeling the behavior that we're asking the kid to do. The other thing is, as I said earlier, correct in private. We don't want to yell at a kid from across the classroom, and the older the kid gets, the more the kid is going to push back if you do that, and then you're going to get caught up in this kind of conflict cycle with the kid. And so go over, correct calmly, firmly, state the behavior you want the kid to do, give them wait time to comply, and then move on. And also positive practice, just like we do with academics. If a kid is doing a math problem and they come up with the wrong answer, we don't say, oh, it's okay, just move on to the next one, right? We say, okay, let's go back and see where we made our mistake, and let's try again to get where we want it to be, the answer to be. And so if we're asking the kid to do something different, or giving them a replacement behavior, then we want to make sure that we're providing them an opportunity to practice and develop skills around that replacement behavior. So positive practice. Other strategies for discouraging inappropriate behavior: switch up your modes of instruction, right? If it's always group lecture, how much engagement are you really going to get from the kids? So some group lectures, fine, and some small group work, independent work, integrating different activities, peer tutoring has shown to be a great strategy. So switch it up and have it be different within your classroom, so it's not the same thing day after day. Instruction influences behavior. So around pacing, if you're standing up and just talking, so your pacing of your teaching as you're going through. We talked about opportunities for students' response and student feedback from the teacher, having those conversations with kids about how they're doing behaviorally, but also academically, right? Having those conversations with them. So I want to say for this next section is around behavioral management techniques, or I've heard them called surface management techniques. But they're strategies to use to interfere with behavior while it's going on in the classroom. So we talked about scanning and moving and being up and walking in the aisles. And so these are some techniques that you can use and still be able to do instruction. I want to say that they go from, for the most part, still do instruction, because they go from the least intrusive to the most intrusive. And as we go through, you'll see what I mean. So the first one is managing the environment. And I talked a little bit about this on a couple of slides ago. How is your environment supporting your teacher routines, your student routines, your rules? Is there anything that you can change up in your classroom that will prevent problem behaviors from occurring? So, for example, my first year of teaching, I was really invested in my classroom, and I put bean bags, and I put blue covers over the fluorescent lights. I had hot air balloons all over my classroom, and I soon found out that that wasn't a very good idea, particularly about the hot air balloons. So when the students would be walking by, they would jump up and they'd hit the hot air balloon, and inadvertently they, would knock it off. So I'd have to get on a chair and get it and, put it back up. Or they would hide contraband in the little baskets of the hot air balloons. So every afternoon I had to kind of go through and do a clear out of contraband. And so needless to say, it caused behaviors. It got me upset because I felt like they weren't respecting my property and all of that kind of stuff. So I took the hot air balloons down, and it took that, temptation, I guess, away from the kids, but it also decreased those behaviors, right? So how is your environment affecting student behavior? The next is prompting, and this can be verbal or nonverbal. It could be, that teacher look when you're kind of making eye contact with the kid. It could be just simply going and tapping on the kid's desk down at their work, what they're supposed to be doing. We'll talk about proximity. It could be just merely going over while you're lecturing and standing next to a kid. But it's a sign, it's a signal to either start a behavior or stop a behavior, right? So start the desired behavior or stop the undesired behavior. Our next is caring gesture or hypodermic affection. If a kid doesn't feel like you care about them, then they're probably gonna not be really engaged with you, right? So it's expressing warm feelings or thoughts or care about a young person. It could be a hand on a shoulder. It could be asking about their grandmother, but just something about that kid that you're making that connection. And as we're moving through, you're seeing that they're becoming more and more intrusive of the teacher, more and more interaction that's going on. So our next behavioral management technique is called hurdle help. And this is used to give a student just a little bit of extra help getting started on a task that they might feel is difficult, or they're becoming frustrated, and kind of, you can see them getting a little bit, not necessarily escalated, but not paying attention to the task. I was in a classroom once and I was doing observations. The teacher did kind of a large group lecture, and then the kids were supposed to work independently by themselves at their desk. And so I was sitting in the back of the classroom. There was a little guy in the back of the classroom. And as soon as he was asked to start working independently, he got up out of his chair. He kind of started pacing around by his desk. He went over and started talking to other kids and came back. And I don't usually do this, but I got up and I went over and I was like, what's going on? He's like, I'm not sure what we're supposed to be doing. So I kind of went over the directions that the teacher had already given, and said, I'll help you with the first one, and then you do the second one. I'll help you with the third one. And so we did that for a couple of the questions, until he just started going on to the next question on his own, and I just kind of eased off and went back to my desk, and or to my area I was sitting, and he was able to independently finish the task. So sometimes that hurdle help, or if you know a kid has a hard time with something in your class, you say, hold on just a minute, let me get everybody going, get started, and I'll come back and we'll start together. So helping that kid get over the academic hurdle. Redirection. It's a method that you use to either redirect a group or an individual's kind of energy, and give them somewhat of a substitute activity to do. Two girls are sitting next to each other and they're kind of bickering back and forth with each other about whatever. And typically what a teacher would do would go over and say, y'all need to stop, you need to get on task, those kinds of things. And the behaviors just kind of continue. So we want to redirect that energy, right? And so maybe take one of the girls and say, hey, can you come over and help me do this? And you just kind of go over and help them do whatever, sort papers, staple papers, take something to another teacher. And you're just kind of changing up the energy, right, around it, and then the kid comes back and is able to get back on task. And then proximity, just the nearness of an adult oftentimes will decrease inappropriate behaviors. For you elementary school teachers, that's why y'all have to sit with them at the lunch table, right? Just because you're there, it's going to help decrease behaviors. But I use this in adult trainings, and you all know teachers are the worst in trainings. And so, I'll be doing my thing up there, and there's a couple of teachers at the back table who are kind of talking, and I don't stop what I'm doing. doing, I just kind of walk back by the table and stand next to them, and that stops it. So if it works for adults, you know it's going to work on kids, right? So proximity, just the nearness of the adult. So as we move forward, we have planned ignoring and positive attention, and these two really need to be able to go together. Um, you can't have one, well, I guess you could have positive attention, but you want to make sure that you're bringing in that positive attention. So it's, uh, let's say a kid, you know, everybody's starting to work and a kid is just kind of tapping his pencil or not getting his book out or not getting on the computer or whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing. We want to go over to kids that are sitting nearby. Thank you all for getting on task. I really appreciate the way that you got started right away. And then if you see the kid who's not getting started right away, get started, then you want to bring that positive attention into them, right, into it. So planned ignoring, ignore those little things that aren't really, you know, driving you crazy, or interrupting instruction for the rest of the kids. And then as soon as you kind of get or see them starting to get themselves on task or get it together, then you want to make sure that you're bringing in that positive attention. Our next is directive statements. Sometimes you have to tell a young person what it is that you expect of them. Not what you want, as I said earlier, not what you want them to stop doing, but what it is that you want them to do. Jacob, please get your Chromebook and go to the site that we discussed and get started on your work. And then walk away for a minute, right? And give that wait time and allow them time to comply with your statement. And then lastly, the most intrusive that you can do is time away. And it can be either non-exclusionary, meaning that you have a place in the back of your classroom that a student kind of goes to calm down, or it can be exclusionary, meaning that the student goes to another staff member's classroom, or maybe the office or somewhere that you know that you typically send kids to be able to do that. But just think that, you know, every time you send a kid out of their classroom, they're losing instructional time, and it should be a big deal to be sent out of the classroom. I only really used time away when it was around, you know, straight up behavior, was when the behavior became such that it was interfering or interrupting lessons for other kids, instruction for other kids. So, behavioral management techniques, starting with managing that environment all the way down to the most intrusive of time away. The other thing that I think is really important for all teachers to kind of have a basic understanding about is what we call the principle of learning, or the ABCs of behavior, three-term contingency, I've heard it called. But it really focuses on the student behavior, making sure that we can understand what the function is. Why is the kid doing what it is that they're doing? Because behavior is communication. The kid is trying to communicate something to us, and most of the time it's not in such a great way, but we're trying to figure out what is the function. So to help us with that, we want to figure out what the antecedent is, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. It can be an internal or external trigger, depending on the student and what's going on. And then the consequence. And I think that oftentimes when we think of consequence, we think of punishment. But when we're thinking of consequence in behavioral terms, it's really about what is happening directly after the problem behavior. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So when we think about antecedents, antecedents can be the time of day, in the morning, late in the afternoon, before lunch, after lunch. It could be the physical setting, meaning it's in math class and I don't know how to do math, or it could be it's so hot in here. It could be whatever's going on in the actual setting. It could be the people. I don't get along with this teacher. In this class that I'm in now, there's a kid that's been bullying me. So what, the people that both staff and other students. It could be the activity that's going on, or it could be the request to move from one activity to another. So from a desirable activity of, lunch and break, to coming back into the classroom and having to write, an essay. So going from something that they like, socializing with their friends, to a task demand that might be a little bit difficult for them. So those are antecedents. When we think about function of behavior, it's typically in schools to either obtain something, attention or that social interaction, or some kind of materials or activity, or sensory kind of stimulation, listening to music, having a little fidget in their hand, turning off the lights for that sensory stimulation. Or in schools, it's around to avoid or escape something, attention or that social interaction, certain materials or activity, or that sensory stimulation that we talked about. The reason it's important for us to try to develop somewhat of a hypothesis or an educated guess around the function of behavior is to make sure that we as the classroom teacher aren't imposing a consequence that is actually strengthening the inappropriate behavior from occurring. So, for example, I'm in math class and you're asking me to do these 5 problems and I really don't know how to do the work, but I know that if I crumble up my paper and I throw it across the room with a few choice words, that you're going to put me out of the classroom. I'm going to be more likely to crumble up my paper and throw it across the classroom because I know then that I'm going to get to avoid escape having to do hard math problems. And so that, having a kind of basic understanding about why kids do certain things is going to help us as the adult in the classroom the best way to respond. So understanding the function of a kid's behavior is really key in helping us understand the best way to respond. So when we think about behavior, remember that I said that it's strengthened or maintained by reinforcement. Punishment weakens behavior, reinforcement strengthens behavior. So when we think about consequence principles, when we're presenting something to the student, it's motivating, it's motivating and reinforcing to the student after the desired behavior. A kid cuts up in class, the students laugh, the other students in the class laugh. We know that the function of the kid's behavior is peer attention, so it's going to strengthen or influence the kid's desire to do that behavior over and over again, because they know when they do it, they're going to get peer attention, and that's the whole reason they're doing it. So a teacher gives her student praise. You really did a great job, persevering through finishing that assignment. That's great. Adult attention, presenting that positive stimulus. Or I really appreciate you doing all of your homework questions. You're really on a great roll with it. Again, giving adult attention or that teacher attention based on that specific behavior. So the teacher is presenting the motivating or reinforcing stimulus of her attention. That's what the kid is trying to get. And then when we think about negative reinforcement, it really is the opposite, right? It's a removal of a usually an adverse stimulus after a behavior is exhibited. So, for example, Bob does the math problems, that's the behavior, to avoid his teacher nagging. That's the negative stimulus, right? The aversive stimulus is the teacher nags him when he doesn't do his math problem. Or, as I said earlier about the example of crumbling up the paper and throwing it across the classroom, the negative stimulus in that is having to do those problems, and then the teacher putting them out of the classroom is strengthening that or reinforcing that. So using those behavioral management techniques that we talked about, really trying to understand the function of a kid's behavior, particularly if it's a behavior that you see the kid, often demonstrate, really trying to get to the bottom of why the kid is doing that behavior is going to help you as the teacher in your response. And then thinking about the ways that your message is conveyed. I know you all have heard a kid say, it's not what she said, it's how she said it, right? And so our message, communication, the way that we interact, 50% of that is our body language. And that could be our facial expression, it could be how we are standing, but it's our body language. 40% of that is your tone of voice. I always say that you can say whatever you need to say to somebody. It's about how you say it that counts. And then lastly, only 10% are the actual words that you're saying. So when we're interacting with kids, and remember that correct firmly and calmly kind of goes back to this, is that think about your own body language, your own tone of voice when you're interacting with the kid. So just something to think about as you're having those interactions with students. So we're going to pause right here for a question. All right, I'm going to leave you with this, and this is probably my most favorite teacher education kind of quote ever, and it's between a teacher and a child. It says, I've come to a frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. It is my personal approach that creates the climate. It is my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated and a child humanized or dehumanized. And I think sometimes that we forget that. We have a lot of power as classroom teachers. All right, here are a couple of the resources, excuse me, that I used in the development of this presentation. And here's my contact information. So if there's anything that we can do for you, please feel free to reach out. If you have questions, comments, or concerns about the module, I'd be happy to have conversation with you. All right, I hope you found it to be useful and a good use of your time. Thank you.